risk it without constraint. She placed the sample into a little folded paper and wrote on the margin of a scrap of Li Wei's petition a single line: "Teach the girls, teach the women. Keep the not for sale." She folded it with the same slow care she used when she hid colors in quilts as a child. Outside, the capital breathed in a way that suggested the world waited on a single hinge. Mei Lin could not see what turn the hinge would take. Would the Grand Secretary accept ritual control, or would he see the blue as incitement? Would the kiln women's hands be given dignity, or only the lash of a buyer's price? These questions lined themselves like storm clouds on the horizon as the courier stepped back into the palace lanes. Zhao put his palm on Mei Lin's shoulder with a gravity that had nothing to do with ceremony. "You must be careful," he said. "This knowledge is a lamp in the dark. Lamps can guide. They can also cause fires. We have to choose where to set the flame." Mei Lin tightened her fingers around the paper in her lap and breathed the smell of kiln and salt into herself. The trip had given her the pigment and answer in matter, but it had asked for more than she had realized it required in return. She had seen men and women extend themselves so that color might belong again to the world, and she had seen the reefs of their lives erode. She had learned methods that could spare some harm, and that would make the blue less gaudy in the light of day. She had a ship's fragment of ore and a head ringing with new knowledge. When they passed through the palace gate, a eunuch intercepted them with a paper stamped by a steward who took pride in his vigilance. "The Grand Secretary's orders," he said, eyes flicking like a hawk. "Audits have tightened." "Where did you go? What did you bring back?" Mei Lin smiled with a small, measured face. "We returned what the temple permitted, a sample for ritual testing." "Nothing more," she said. Her voice was steady. Inside, her pulse was a frantic brush stroke. That night she dreamed of the temple kiln and the woman who had handed her a bottle the size of a thumb. In the dream the kiln opened like a mouth and breathed blue into the emperor's ear, and he began to sing a poem about a boat and about a father. She woke with the taste of salt and charcoal in her mouth and a sense that the blue, like all precious things, would ask for both courage and price. The courier's lanterns swung the next morning as the palace prepared for another week of ritual. Mei Lin took the tempered pigment into her studio and set it on the bench like an accusation and a benediction. She opened her private journal and, in ink damp with resolve, she wrote down the recipe variations, the names of the women at the kiln and the cove, the small concessions they had won and the ones they had not. She wrote them so that someone else might follow and choose differently. When she set down her brush, a knock came at the garden gate. Eunuch Rong whispered, breath smelling faintly of jasmine, "The Grand Secretary has increased inspections of craftspeople returning from provincial journeys. He claims it is about taxes and smuggling. He will ask what you bought." Mei Lin set the little jar of blue into the shadow beneath a stack of rice papers and looked out through the lattice toward the palace's grey roofs. The memory of the miner's hands would not leave her. The woman by the pit had held a thumb-sized stone like a talisman and asked a thing that had been made small by time. "Who will teach our children to find work that is not bone and pit?" She answered that night in the only way she knew. She painted a tiny swallow on the corner of a practice scroll, using just a sliver of the tempered blue. It was not meant for display. It was meant to remind herself and the few she trusted that color was not only for crowns. As the paint dried, it drew a small, luminous line like a promise. The question at the heart of it threaded through her like a fine stitch. Could a single modest, careful act of restoration rewrite how a nation accounted for beauty? The answer, she understood, would arrive in color and accusation both. The kiln had given them a sample. The sea had given them a story. The court would now decide whether art was a dissipative pleasure or a moral instrument. And the Grand Secretary, whose hands would not be stained with pigment, would, she feared, see only threat. At dawn, a courier from the Grand Secretary's office arrived with new orders, a seal marked in black ink like an edict from winter. Mei Lin read only the first lines: all imported ores and pigments shall be subject to immediate audit. All private kilns must register. The paper trembled in her hand like a small wind. She folded it and slid it into her journal, then reached for the little jar of blue and the scrap of paper she had written on by the sea. She put them together as if they were two halves of a hymn. Outside, the palace lantern swayed, and someone in the outer yard laughed, a brittle sound that could have been joy or the brittle snap of fear. Mei Lin lifted her brush and began to paint, her strokes deliberate and low as a prayer. The blue on her finger felt like a new marrow. She set it with care, and then, as if the act alone was not enough, she thought of the miners and the kiln women and of Jia's caution. The world would soon demand an answer beyond the stroke of a brush. She could not see how the capital would answer, but she had seen the places the pigment came from, and she had a story to bring back, not only of color recovered, but of hands and cliffs and salted water. If the court would listen, she would ask for stewardship rather than spectacle. If it would not, she would teach a handful of girls along the coast the recipe for a tempered blue that would not hollow the earth. She thought of her grandmother's rhythm, the patient circular grind. She thought of the temple women's ledger and of the miners' hollow faces. Mei Lin washed her brush in a basin and watched the water go the color of early dusk. She lifted her head, and for a breath she heard a sound she had not expected. In some small room of the palace, the emperor hummed a line of an old song. The sound was like a bell from a distant shore. It was a small thing, but it changed the gravity of her next choice. Outside, in the dark, someone else made a choice as well. A shadow detached itself from the palace corridor and moved with the deliberate slowness of a man who had learned that power needed patience rather than haste. The Grand Secretary's steps were quiet, but they were measured. He would read the map of routes, calculate risk, and then either by law or spectacle he would act. Mei Lin set her little swallow aside and wrapped the sample in paper once more. She would not sleep easily that night. She had a pigment and a conscience, a kiln and a pit, a law and a ledger. The coming days would ask of her the shape of sacrifice. The harbor wind spoke of a tide that would not be turned by a single hand, and yet, in the kiln's glow, she had seen that a single, carefully placed color could shift a face toward remembering. When dawn blood into the palace lanes, a courier's footfall scattered pigeons on the tiles. The stage was being set, a choice between preservation and consumption, between stewardship and spectacle. Mei Lin breathed the smell of glaze and salt and, with hands that remembered the sea and the stone, prepared to place a very small color on a very large stage. The horse bells rang somewhere toward the great hall. The next hour would tell which way the palace would tilt. The palace had become a museum of absence. Even when the sun slid through latticed windows and never failed to strike hard on lacquer and silk, the light returned only grays muted, softened, as if the world had been washed in milk then left to dry. Mei Lin moved within that gentled world like a woman who kept her own private maps of color. Her studio, carved between receiving rooms and the palace kitchens, was a small island, a square of worn wood, a low shelf where porcelain cups waited like patient mouths, and a table scattered with brushes whose hairs still remembered their old tasks. She had come back to the palace that morning not with fanfare, but a pocket of risk sewn tight in folds of cotton. The mixture she carried smelled faintly of iron and salt, and the brown tang of fermentation. It smelled, to her, of the seaside afternoons when her grandmother had first taught her to read stone. The forbidden fragment, an unfamiliar mineral name. A sliver of blue ground into a scrap of southern silk had been a rumor until she had seen the bloom on the rim of a cup. After that bloom, rumor became responsibility. Mei Lin's hands were disciplined by years of precise motions. She threaded her thumb under a teacup and turned it until the light pressed against the porcelain at the right angle. Then, with the patience of someone who had learned to measure time in the round of a pebble against stone, she began to grind. The mineral slept in a small jar. She scraped a crumb with the tip of a bone knife and set it aside. A few grains of crushed rice, a warmth of boiled glutinous paste. Droplets of clear spring water, everything measured by how the paste hung on her brush, rather than by any number she could spell. The grinding took a long, reverent hour. There is a certain music to such labor, the steady, soft scrape of stone, the faint clink of porcelain, the breath of a room held in the hush between strokes. Mei Lin thought, as she always did when mixing pigment, of the stories women had hidden inside songs. Her grandmother had whispered that recipes were not only chemicals and kiln heat, but also the names of women and the rhythms of waves. To prepare the mixture was to recite a litany, to make present those who had taught her how color was held. She remembered her grandmother's hands, coarse and warm, pressing a pestle into a bowl, and the lesson that the slightest alteration, too much ash, too warm a ferment, would break the color's trust. When the paste glowed, she tested it on the porcelain rim. The bead spread like a secret, first a shy glimmer, then confidence. It caught the light and deepened until she thought of sea at noon, and a silent, impossible joy unfurled in her chest. She could have kept that joy to herself. It would have been simple and safe. But the palace was a place where small objects accumulated meaning. A swallow painted on a screen, a seam of embroidery, a child's toy, these were things that held lives. She had come for a particular swallow. The screen was a private commission, a modest folding panel meant to stand behind a low couch in an inner audience hall. It had been intended for a minor ritual, a token of remembrance for an afternoon when palace women would read poetry and place tea in simple cups. Mei Lin had selected it because of the small blue field in the center where old lapis had once shimmered. That field now lay as ordinary wood, peeled and gray. She set the screen upright and arranged her pigments on a tray, covering them with a silk cloth in case a passing servant glanced too long. She worked with the discipline of someone who knew both how to begin and how to keep a beginning secret. The first stroke was always a test of faith. Her brush came to the screen's grain with a whisper, a careful weight. The blue spread, a breath of it matching the curve of the swallow's wing, and the bird seemed to gather itself as if waiting for this color to finish its thought. Each feather required particular gestures. The wing's outer arc demanded a thicker bead of pigment, the throat a thinner line. Her hand measured the history of such lines, how a crowded harbor's gull feather differs from a river swallow's, how the southern ateliers had taught particular ways of holding light. As she painted, Mei Lin felt the room's sensibility shift. Courtiers were not oblivious. They had learned to move through pallor like actors on set, but they noticed small recoveries as if someone had called their name in the dark. The attendants who stood by, some to hold objects, some as witnesses, fell silent when the blue found the swallow. There was always that threshold moment when art stopped being private and became a test. When the screen was brought before the emperor, the hall was modestly filled, a scattering of ministers, a few ladies of the palace, and the small retinue of men who mattered most to the bureaucrat who counted favor like coins. The emperor occupied his chair with a gentle patron's stoop, his hands laid in his lap as if the world might bruise them. He had been taught, all his life, to receive gifts with the correct table of gratitude, a small bow, an acknowledgement, a poem repeated from archive. Yet the small and precise world of ritual had been perforated by forgetfulness. Sometimes he would forget the day, sometimes the name of a favorite groom. Those moments passed like hisses along the line of servants until panic would rise in the grand secretary's chest like an old wound. Mei Lin did not stand immediately before him. Protocol placed the artist aside while gifts were unwrapped, and that distance had become her shield. She watched as a young attendant, because someone had taught him careful hands, opened the panel and tilted it so the light washed across the birds. The blue answered the light like a held breath. For a few seconds the Emperor's face lost its careful blankness. His fingers gripped the armrest, and he leaned forward as if trying to catch a word someone had spoken on the edge of hearing. A name left his lips, an ordinary thing that suddenly had the force of revelation. He said Quao, which made heads turn because Quao had been the name of a childhood companion. A boy who had once shared salted plums with a future emperor on a wharf by the South Sea. The attendants responded in the small, tectonic ways of such moments. A hand covered a mouth. A sleeve was pressed to the face. A minister's posture shifted from business to prayer. The emperor smiled in a way that took the court's breath. It was not the practiced, careful smile of ceremony, but something private, like a recollection opening. There was, in that smile, a precarious thing, proof that color could touch memory. Scholar Leway, who had been standing with a sheaf of archival notes, stepped forward with the learned urgency of a man who had been waiting for evidence to justify his instincts. His voice was low but clear. Color, he said, is not mere ornament. It has always been a device of memory. In ritual, in court, a pigment is a cue. It binds name to face, epoch to feeling. To see blue there is to see a bridge. That Li Wei should speak was not happenstance. He had been among the small group who argued that art functioned not only to please an eye, but to hold and transmit meaning. He had once written of the ways dynasties had used color to define state ritual. How red could be codified as auspicious and then quietly stripped away from provinces deemed suspect. To him, the swallow's blue was both testimony and a kind of ritual repair. He had hoped to make this argument before ministers who preferred accounts and ledgers. The emperor's half-recovered smile made his point easy to dress in authority. Grand Secretary Shen listened like a tide listening for undercurrent. His face remained a plane of control, shale and restraint. He had, since the first reports of faded banners, moved through the palace like a man smoothing a map of fractures. His logic was simple and iron. Color was a variable that encouraged unrest. If the past could be made present through a pigment, then a restless populace might be seduced by memory into rebellion. He used words like order and austerity as if they were medicines. Yet in that hall, watching the emperor's brief clarity, Shen recognized more than policy. He recognized the threat of what this could mean if left without governance. For a moment, the hall held two contradictory truths at once, the warmth of memory returning, and the cold arithmetic of power watching it like a hawk. The emperor reached out to touch the painted swallow's wing, and his fingers left no smear. Pigments, if properly tempered, did not bleed to sullied skin. He let out a soft laugh, a sound that had once bound the palace, and a lady behind the emperor dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Li Wei, sensing the tide might be used to frame art as ritual, offered a short, measured refrain that told of long dynastic precedents. He quoted ancient ritual manuals and old edicts about court color, careful to couch his speech in terms that would make ministers feel they were following, not being led. But somewhere, in that quiet rhetoric, a different sound threaded through, the barely audible intake of breath from Grand Secretary Shen. He had entered his office that morning with a roster of austerities to present. Now he realized he must account for this new variable. A woman had brought back a hue that could call the emperor's childhood name. In the immediate calculus of politics, that was a lever. Mei Lin felt both relieved and profoundly exposed. She had not expected the emperor to react so clearly. She had done the work because she believed it was right and because she could not let the swallow remain dull. The way the blue drew the emperor's memory was a vindication of craft, of the small faith that pigments could be repositories of feeling. Yet with each applause, each hush of astonishment, she felt the mesh of watchers tighten. Court attention was not neutral. It required currency, favor, threat, calculation. The same audience that released tenderness could also consign her to the Grand Secretary's ledger of dangers. After the ceremony, ministers filed out in their ordered lines. Some came to murmur congratulations. Others spoke in the measured cadences of men making notes. Scholar Lai Wei approached Mai Lin and laid a hand briefly on her shoulder, not as patronage but as recognition. "You have done more than restore a screen," he said softly. "You have made a precedent." Mai Lin wanted to answer with the language of craft about temper and mordant and the soul of a pigment, but the crowd listened to histories, not recipes. An attendant brought a discreet cup of warm tea to Mai Lin. Its scent was mild, a reminder that rituals need little courtesies. She sipped slowly, letting the warmth sink into her palms. An old anxiety pooled in the back of her throat. She had tasted the danger of attention before. In the hush that followed the first anonymous recovery, but joy still beat like a small drum at her ribs. A faded world had given her a sliver of clarity. The Grand Secretary did not approach Mai Lin. Instead he watched from a distance, as if inspecting an object through lenses made of policy and fear. After a measured pause, he drew near the Emperor and murmured words that were invisible to most. He consulted lists and remembered precedents. His expression when he turned to his aides was unreadable but not idle. He had seen the evidence he needed to begin a ledger. The blue was no longer only an artifact, it was a data point. When Mai Lin left the hall, she walked between tapestries whose threads had lost their old luster. The torchlight made the screen's blue look softer, more intimate, as if it were keeping a secret. She had expected to be feted or reprimanded. Instead, a strange silence followed her steps, the kind that is both blessing and warning. She felt the weight of her hand's stains, a faint wash of cobalt clinging to the webbing between her fingers. And for a heartbeat she thought of the women who had taught her grandmother pressing a pestle, unnamed southern artisans folding recipes into songs. At the threshold of her studio, a servant passed a sealed note into her palm with the practiced discretion of long palace routines. It was a slip of paper from Lai Wei. "Be careful." Mai Lin's laugh at that terse counsel was too soft for any courtier to hear. She folded the paper and slipped it into her sleeve, where the edge of the parchment pressed like a small compass. She did not sleep that night. Her dreams were not of danger so much as of memory itself, of a child on a wharf holding a kite string, the sky a particular blue that now lived, with a small insolence, on a painted screen. When the final hour came and the palace lay under a hush of paper lanterns and the river's low murmur, Mai Lin sat before her table and wrote in her private journal. She described the mixture in notes that would help her recall later: a pinch more rice, a sliver less ash, a pause by the fire. She described not only the chemistry but the feeling, because she understood that a recipe without its story would wither. Yet even as she catalogued success, a thought edged into her mind like a chill from an open window. The Grand Secretary had watched. The next morning the court would continue with its brittle routine audiences, petitions, the small injustices that folded into bureaucratic weather. Mai Lin would continue to paint if the world allowed it. The Emperor's name hung in the air like a bell that had been struck once and might not ring again. She had opened a small door into a room of recollection. Whether that door would become a refuge for the court's dying tenderness or a gateway to accusation remained to be seen. She laid down her brush and listened. Somewhere in the palace a sentinel cleared his throat in the way men do, when they notice a change in the wind. Mai Lin's pulse answered not with panic, but with a steadier thing, resolve. The color had proven itself, and that fact could not be erased by edict or by fear. Still, she knew the work of keeping color alive was not merely mixing and painting. It was weaving networks and keeping secrets, answering not simply to beauty but to the necessities of survival. In the distance, beyond the palace walls, the city went on. Vendors arranged their goods. A boy under a cart squinted at the sky. The world beyond the lacquered halls might be indifferent. Inside, however, a new variable had been introduced, a hue that could call a name. Mei Lin felt the delicate exhilaration of being at once artist and witness. She understood, in a way that was both terrifying and sustaining, that this small triumph would be the seed of storms to come. The blue would not remain private for long. Footsteps echoed down the corridor outside her studio, measured, too precise for a servant. She straightened and smoothed her sleeves without thinking, like someone who had been taught to receive complaint with grace. The door opened a sliver. A figure entered and paused in the doorway, his robes dark as winter soil. It was not Shen. Not yet. It was an attendant bearing a folded strip of silk. "From the Emperor," the man said, bowing. "He wished for you to know he remembers in part." Mei Lin took the silk with trembling fingers. The strip was dyed faintly in a blue that, up close, still seemed to hum. She pressed it to her lips as if in thanks, and, for a single, luminous heartbeat, the world seemed less washed out. Then the attendant closed the door with the careful, final sound of a hand settling a lid. Beyond, somewhere, Grand Secretary Shen sharpened his strategy in a ledger of possible threats. The hush that followed was not merely the end of ceremony, but the beginning of calculation. Mei Lin folded the strip into her journal and sealed the page with a blot of diluted pigment. She felt the beginning of a new resolve, to learn not only how to restore color, but how to keep it safe. The blue would be both her triumph and her hazard. In the polished mirror of lacquer, the swallow's wing flashed in the corner of the room, and the painted bird, which had been mute for so long, seemed to tilt its head as if listening for a name. Outside, the palace moved into the slow machinery of day. Within, a woman whose fingers knew the secret of sea and stone sat very still, aware that she had done something that might yet change the arc of memory. As the morning light shifted, a shadow crossed the screen. It had the shape of a man who kept lists. Mei Lin met that shadow with a steadiness she had not known she owned. She whispered to the swallow, more to herself than to any audience, "We will keep the color," she promised, "and we will teach it to those who must carry it on." A soft tapping at the outer gate announced the arrival of another morning's business. The palace would awake to new demands, and somewhere not far away, Grand Secretary Shen would make the choice to watch more closely. Mei Lin rose and gathered her brushes. The world had given her a single, dangerous gift, proof that a pigment could do what it was made to do. Now the question was whether proof would be a spark for renewal or the flint that ignited a stricter hand. Either way, she would have to be ready. The sound at the gate was the first note of a chord that would not yet resolve. Mei Lin held the brush over the cup of water and watched the blue diffuse, the way a color moves through liquid, reflecting how memory moves through the mind. The palace felt suddenly less like a museum and more like a place where things might be remembered again, if only briefly. Outside, the city continued its small commerce of living. Inside, she folded the journal to keep the blue from dust and went to see who would come to thank or to accuse her next. The palace moved like a thing in slow mourning. Courtyards that once hummed with the barter of color now kept their voices low, as if a respectful hush might spare what remained. Lacquered boxes shone like old teeth, dull instead of bright. Banners that had hung like statements of claimed territory sagged to the ground in pallid sympathy. Mei Lin looked through the lattice of her studio at those softened walls and thought of a painting she could not finish, swallows in flight. Their bellies once a lacquered lapis, wings brushed in the quicksilver of a child's laughter. She had penciled the outlines and left the center blank because the oil that would make the swallows breathe was outlawed, or had become too costly, or had been made shameful by politics. The law named nothing so poetic. It spoke in proclamations and purges, in lists of forbidden goods and prescribed rituals. The effect, however, was a silence of hue. She kept a journal where the words were not always words. Entries were notes of color, as imperative to her as prayers, a notation for the green of moss on a southern wall, the exact sound of a child's exhalation on a hot morning when vermilion burned, the the mineral grain of azurite ground with rice. The fragments of recipe she carried, stitchings of southern script, and a smear of impossible blue were tucked into the back of the book, folded beneath a page of sketches.